In January of 2021, a team of engineers at Jiangnan University in Wuxi, China, published a design for a solar panel that keeps making electricity after the sun goes down. Let me tell you what that actually means in plain English. This panel does not store power in a battery and release it later. It generates a live current at midnight using nothing but the cold night sky. Solar cells have always needed light to make electrons move. This one flips the entire rulebook. And that is just the beginning. The real story is not that it works in the dark. It is how they got a single panel to run two completely opposite jobs at once. If a solar panel that ignores sunset sounds interesting, hit a quick like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how China engineered a panel that never fully stops. The photovoltaic effect has one non-negotiable requirement, and engineers have built the entire solar industry around respecting it. Photons in, electrons out. No light, no current. That is not a design limitation. That is physics. Dating back to work first described by Albert Einstein in 1905 and confirmed in solar cells ever since. For as long as photovoltaic panels have existed, the rule has held without exception. Every solar farm on the planet, from small rooftop arrays to installations covering thousands of acres, goes fully dark the moment the sun drops below the horizon. Here is what that rule actually costs. Grid operators call the resulting problem the duck curve, a term used by the California Independent System Operator and adopted by utilities worldwide to describe the steep, predictable crash in solar output every evening, right as household demand climbs. To manage that crash, the industry has poured enormous money into lithium battery storage built for exactly one job, bridging the 12 hours when panels do nothing. Global investment in battery storage paired with solar passed $40 billion a year by the middle of this decade, according to the International Energy Agency. That is not a rounding error. That is an entire secondary industry built to compensate for something a panel cannot do on its own. Picture a race car with an engine that only runs while the hood is open to direct sunlight. Close the hood, and the engine stops dead no matter how much fuel is left in the tank. That is a solar panel at dusk. The chemistry is fine. The materials are fine. The moment the photons disappear, the system goes inert, and every watt of capacity sitting inside that panel becomes furniture until sunrise. Solar standards. Bodies design certification tests around daylight hours only. Utility planners build entire evening capacity models around the assumption that output simply ends at dusk, then hand the load off to gas peaker plants or stored battery reserves. Nobody in that planning process asked whether the panel itself could be redesigned. They asked how to build around it, which is a very different question. Here's what most people never think about. The panel does not become useless at night. It becomes something more specific. A warm object radiating heat straight up into a sky that is, on a clear night, colder than deep winter. For decades, that outward heat was treated as pure waste, a thermodynamic afterthought nobody bothered chasing. The industry did not see a resource up there. It saw a dead 12 hours to be managed, not solved, and an entire generation of engineers grew up accepting that framing without question. But that assumption did not survive contact with a small group of physicists who looked at the problem from the opposite direction and asked what would happen if you stopped treating the night sky as empty and started treating it as cold enough to do actual work. What they found did not just chip at the wall standing between solar panels and true around-the-clock generation. It cracked that wall in a way the industry was not prepared to defend. In May of 2022, a team at the University of New South Wales in Sydney did something that had never been demonstrated in a laboratory before. They built a semiconductor device made from materials borrowed from night vision technology and proved it could generate a real electrical current using nothing but infrared heat radiating into a clear night sky. The device was called a thermoradiative diode. The stated goal was narrow and modest, not to power anything useful yet, just to prove the physics was real and measurable, not theoretical. The reaction from the wider solar industry was polite and dismissive in roughly equal measure. The output recorded in that first test was about 100,000 times smaller than what a standard panel produces at noon. Several voices in renewable energy research called it a curiosity. Technically sound, commercially irrelevant, decades away from anything a grid operator would ever plan around. One of the researchers involved even admitted the biggest challenge was not generating the current. It was detecting that the current existed at all. Here is where the consensus broke. They said the same thing about the very first photovoltaic cells in the 1950s, when Bell Labs unveiled a silicon solar cell that converted about 6% of sunlight into electricity, and most of the engineering world treated it as a laboratory toy. Too inefficient and too expensive to ever power anything beyond a satellite far from any power line. That 6% climbed to over 25% within a single lifetime. We all know how that ended. What made the 2022 result different was not the size of the number. It was the direction of the physics. A solar cell absorbs. This device emitted and generated power anyway. Researchers began describing it as a solar cell running in reverse, and the phrase stuck, because it captured something the skeptics had missed entirely. If a device could produce current by radiating heat outward instead of absorbing it, then the 12 hours everyone had written off as dead time were not actually empty. They were simply untapped, in a direction nobody had bothered to look before. The program that followed did not stay confined to a single diode sitting in a lab in Sydney. Teams elsewhere, including engineers in China, took the underlying principle and asked a much harder question. Not whether a device could generate a trace of current at night, but whether that same principle could be built directly into the same panel already doing the job of catching sunlight during the day. That question is where the story stops being about proving an old rule wrong and starts being about building something that could actually work in the field, not just on a bench. Here's the part that puts everything into perspective. On a clear night, an object radiating heat can cool below the surrounding air temperature, which is exactly why a car windshield can frost over even when the thermometer reads above freezing. The glass is not losing heat to the cold air around it. It is losing heat straight up, into a sky that behaves, thermally speaking, like the near vacuum of space. Engineers call this radiative cooling, and for most of human history it has been treated purely as a nuisance. Nobody built anything to capture it. They just accepted the frost and moved on. The technical solution came from flipping that nuisance into a resource instead of an annoyance. Instead of letting a warm surface bleed heat uselessly into the night sky, researchers coated the underside of a panel with materials engineered to channel that outbound infrared through a thermoelectric layer, a component that generates current whenever one side of it is warmer than the other. The panel itself becomes the warm side. The night sky becomes the cold side. And the temperature gap between those two sides is what does the actual work. That gap is not small. Test conditions have recorded a panel surface running as much as 70 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than the surrounding air on a clear, dry night, cold enough to feel like a completely different season pressed directly against a warm hand. Documented pilot measurement specs from thermoradiative testing have put the resulting output in the range of a few milliwatts per square meter, enough to register clearly on precise instruments, though nowhere close to daytime output levels. Here is the short version, stated plainly. That is not enough power to run a household. That is enough power to prove the concept works without a single moving part, a single battery, or a single ray of sunlight anywhere near it. The engineers who ran these early tests were not chasing a product yet. They were chasing certainty. Proof that the temperature gap between a warm panel and a cold sky could reliably be converted into current night after night, regardless of humidity or season. That certainty is what turned a curiosity into a foundation something larger could actually be built on. But a milliwatt reading in a controlled lab is not the same thing as a usable product, and engineers knew it immediately. The layer built to catch outbound heat at night has fundamentally different physical needs than the layer built to catch inbound light during the day. One wants to radiate freely into open sky. The other wants to absorb efficiently and hold on to every photon it catches. Stack them carelessly, and each one actively gets in the other's way. Solving the first mechanism only exposed a second, far more stubborn problem sitting directly underneath it. And that second problem is where the real engineering work actually began. For the Jiangnan University team, the bigger problem was not proving radiative cooling could generate current. That part was already settled. The bigger problem was building a single panel that could switch identities twice a day without anyone touching it, absorbing light in daylight, radiating heat after dark, and never confusing the two jobs even for a moment. Two physical processes that want opposite conditions, forced to share the same square foot of hardware. Here's the counterintuitive part. Conventional engineering logic says you isolate systems that work against each other, put the daytime layer here, the nighttime layer somewhere else entirely, and keep them from interfering. The Chinese research team did the opposite. They asked what would happen if you stacked both functions directly on top of one another in the same physical footprint and let the panel decide which mode to run based on nothing more than the temperature difference already present in its immediate environment. It should not have worked. A photovoltaic layer generates heat as a byproduct of catching sunlight, heat that a nighttime radiative layer needs to shed efficiently once the sun goes down. Left uncontrolled, the daytime layer's residual warmth would blunt the nighttime layer's cooling advantage before it even had a chance to start. The fix was a thermally decoupled architecture, a standard photovoltaic layer on top, a thermoelectric generator layer directly beneath it, separated just enough that each layer could behave as if it were the only one there, while still sharing a single unified electrical output. The design, detailed in research out of Jiangnan University, working alongside the Singapore University of Technology and Design, modeled and tested a system generating power continuously through both halves of the day-night cycle, measured in hundreds of milliwatts per square yard during daylight, and a smaller but real and continuous output after sunset, with no true gap between the two states. It sounds like it should not work. That is exactly why it does. The panel was no longer choosing between two competing jobs. It was doing both, on a schedule dictated entirely by the sun and the sky above it, without a single instruction from a human operator anywhere in the loop. But a working architecture, proven on a bench in a lab, is one thing. Keeping that architecture stable across an entire field of panels, through weather, humidity swings, dust, and years of outdoor wear, is an entirely different problem. And it is the problem that ultimately decides whether any of this ever leaves the laboratory and reaches a rooftop. Here's the coordination problem nobody talks about. A single panel switching modes twice a day is a controlled experiment. A field of panels doing it in sync, across changing cloud cover, humidity, and seasonal temperature swings is a logistics problem disguised as a physics problem. The old approach to solar reliability solved this by brute force. Oversized battery banks, redundant inverters, and enough slack built into the system to absorb whatever the panels failed to deliver overnight. That old approach worked, but it never actually closed the gap. It just built a very expensive workaround around it, year after year, project after project. The new architecture discards that workaround entirely, because the panel itself no longer has a gap that needs covering. Instead, each unit continuously tracks the temperature differential between its own surface and the surrounding air, and shifts its internal current path toward whichever layer is doing the useful work at that moment. Daylight absorption, nighttime radiation, or the narrow transition window at dawn and dusk when both layers are active at once. Here's the part that makes this genuinely extraordinary. That switching happens the same way a navigation app reroutes a driver mid-trip. Not on a fixed timer, not on a schedule set the night before, but continuously, in direct response to real conditions changing in real time. No operator flips a switch at sunset. No control room issues a command. The panel simply follows the temperature gradient it is already sitting inside, second by second, without being told to. Pilot testing of this integrated architecture has been run across small experimental arrays rather than full commercial farms, with researchers confirming continuous current output logged across complete day-night cycles rather than isolated daytime or nighttime snapshots taken in isolation. Coverage so far remains limited to test sites rather than grid-connected installations, but the logged data spans full 24-hour windows, repeated across multiple cycles, not a single lucky reading. This is where the story really begins to separate from every other solar breakthrough that came before it. Most efficiency gains improve the number a panel produces at noon. This one changes what hours of the day even count as productive. The verdict is simple, and it is worth saying plainly. For the first time, a single solar panel produced a real, uninterrupted power curve 24 hours long with no dead hours anywhere inside it. But a laboratory confirming continuous output is not the same thing as the number the rest of the world would eventually be asked to trust, and that number needed a second, harder look before anyone was willing to put it in print. Here is the honest picture. The combined day-night output confirmed across testing came in at roughly 700 milliwatts per square yard during daylight hours, and a genuinely continuous secondary output in the tens of milliwatts per square yard overnight. Modest by grid standards, But for the first time in the history of the technology, never zero. Researchers ran the numbers twice before publication because a solar technology claiming literally no dead hours is exactly the kind of claim that invites hard scrutiny, and it got that scrutiny in full, translated to something you can actually picture. At today's output levels, a single panel running this architecture could keep a remote environmental sensor, a small emergency beacon, or a set of off-grid LED lights running straight through the night without a battery doing any of the work at all. That is not enough yet to replace the battery bank sitting behind your neighborhood solar farm. It is enough to eliminate the battery entirely for a specific, growing category of small, remote, always-on devices that have never had a truly gapless power source before this design existed. Visual and thermal confirmation from testing showed exactly what the physics predicted. Infrared imaging of the panel surface at night revealed a measurable sustained temperature, differential against the surrounding air, holding steady for hours rather than minutes, which is precisely the condition the thermoelectric layer needs to keep generating current without interruption. Here's the trade-off nobody should skip past. This technology is not close to replacing grid-scale storage, and the researchers involved have been direct about that limitation. The nighttime output is still a small fraction of what the same panel produces at noon, and scaling it into something that powers a house rather than a sensor remains years away. What changed is not the size of the number. What changed is that the number is no longer zero, on a technology the entire industry had permanently written off as a daylight-only proposition for more than half a century. That is not a footnote. That is the ceiling breaking. For the first time in the history of photovoltaic engineering, a single unit of solar hardware has demonstrated it does not have to go dark, ever, regardless of what time the sun sets or how long the night stretches on. If a panel that refuses to fully shut off at night surprised you, the next part is going to be even harder to believe. Hit subscribe so you are there when we cover it. And the honest picture gets bigger from here, because a result like this does not stay confined to one lab in Wuxi. It raises an immediate question for every research group and every manufacturer working in solar right now. If the night gap is not actually a law of physics, who else is already trying to close it, and how fast can any of them get there? Here is what the historical parallel actually teaches. Standards, bodies and energy researchers have been transparent about where this technology currently sits. Promising, verified in controlled testing, and still years away from commercial deployment at any real scale. The International Renewable Energy Agency and multiple national energy research institutes have begun tracking thermoradiative and hybrid day-night photovoltaic work as an emerging category worth funding rather than a curiosity worth dismissing. A shift in institutional posture that took the original diode demonstration less than 3 years to earn. The industries most immediately positioned to benefit are not power utilities. They are the sectors that depend on small, continuous, unattended power in places a battery replacement crew cannot easily or affordably reach. Environmental and climate sensor networks, remote telecom relay stations, agricultural monitoring across large unpowered farmland, and emergency infrastructure deployed after natural disasters, where every battery that does not need replacing is one less point of failure in the field. For a wildfire sensor network or a flood monitoring station sitting in terrain nobody wants to visit twice a year, a panel that never fully goes dark is not a curiosity. It is a maintenance problem quietly disappearing. What adoption actually requires is not a mystery, and it is not cheap. Thermoelectric materials capable of surviving years of outdoor exposure while maintaining efficient heat transfer are more expensive to manufacture at scale than standard photovoltaic silicon, and scaling milliwatt per square yard output into genuinely useful wattage means either much larger surface areas or continued gains in material efficiency. Neither path is trivial. Both are exactly the kind of problem manufacturing precision solves gradually, year over year, not overnight. The historical parallel is worth sitting with a little longer. Photovoltaic cells themselves went from 6% efficiency in the 1950s to over 25% today, a four-fold gain achieved across roughly 70 years of incremental materials engineering, not a single dramatic breakthrough. Nobody expects thermoradiative hybrid panels to take 70 years to mature, given how much manufacturing knowledge already exists to build on. But the pattern holds regardless. The physics gets proven early, and the real gains come from years of unglamorous materials work that follows quietly afterward. That is the genuine advantage sitting inside this technology, and it is harder to copy than a patent filing. It is not one clever idea. It is a manufacturing pipeline capable of producing thermally decoupled, dual-function panels at consistent quality, at scale, without the yield problems that kill most laboratory breakthroughs before they ever reach a factory floor. The limit here was never political, it was thermodynamic, and now it is a materials manufacturing problem instead, which is a very different kind of problem to solve, and a far more solvable one. And if closing a gap everyone assumed was permanent sounds familiar, it should, because engineers in China have gone after this exact kind of impossible limitation before, just from a completely different angle entirely. If a panel that refuses to go dark at night caught your attention, the other project worth your time is the one where engineers stopped treating open ocean as wasted space and covered it in solar panels instead. I already covered that one. China covered. The ocean with solar panels, the results will shock you, and what they found out there is just as hard to believe. Same relentless engineering instinct, aimed at a completely different kind of dead zone. The real meaning of this story is not that one panel in one lab produced a few extra milliwatts after sunset. It is that the single most fundamental assumption underlying more than half a century of solar engineering, that photovoltaics simply stop existing at night, just turned out to be an engineering gap instead of a law of nature. Every battery bank, every grid balancing algorithm, every dollar spent bridging the duck curve was built around a limitation that may not be permanent after all, and that is a much bigger deal than a milliwatt reading suggests on its own. If you made it this far, you now understand more about how solar power actually works and why it fails at night than most people who write about renewable energy for a living. What was actually proven here is narrow but real. A single unit of hardware can absorb sunlight during the day and radiate heat for current at night, continuously, with no engineered handoff between the two states and no operator ever touching it. That is not a battery trick dressed up as innovation. That is the panel itself refusing to go idle, on its own, for the first time in the history of the technology. If this changed how you think about what a solar panel is actually capable of, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Should the solar industry be pouring its research money into squeezing more raw efficiency out of daytime panels, or into closing the night gap entirely, even if nighttime output stays small for years to come? Both camps have a real argument. I want to hear which one you are in. I read every single one. See you in the next one.